Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. We are going to talk about On Killing today. This is the book, I just read it, On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. Now, usually I do these things on my own, but I've got a friend who is currently in a program to get his doctorate in psychology. And we served together. We went to Field Medical Training Battalion in San Diego on our way to be FMF corpsman and serve with the Marine Corps as a medics. So I wanted to bring him on because he reached out to me and we had a short discussion online. I thought it would be a great way to talk about this topic with somebody who has a bit more education or a lot of more education and experience on this specific stuff. So we're going to go through and talk to Michael about his experience in the military, where some of our experiences overlap, and some of the ways that we see this book and the topics in it through our experience and through his current journey in education. So thanks for stopping by, and let's get into it.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be joined by an old friend of mine from the military. Michael's on with us. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this book today, On Killing, is not just because I found it incredibly interesting and I learned a lot from it. I started having a conversation with Michael about it, and Michael's currently studying psychology over at Alliant University in San Diego, where my wife went, and many of our friends in San Diego attended. So it's interesting that I get to talk to him about that and hear a little bit of the history of how he got here, and then later on we'll talk about some of the stuff in the book. So, Michael, why don't you tell everybody about a bit about your military history, where some of our military history overlapped, and I might interject with some of the stuff that I've experienced. But if you wouldn't mind starting with that, we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I enlisted in the Navy in pretty late 2008. Went to boot camp, uh, Naval Hospital Corps School in early 2009. Um, and then I had to wait. It was almost 6 months, I think, to go to field med as a
Why so
corpsman.
long?
Um, there was a lot of people classing up, and we had to wait. We had a lot of PSIs, the waiting crew. And I was going to Okinawa, so I couldn't go early. I guess they needed a particular time to be set for that. So I actually enjoyed my 6 months of waiting because I was dating at the time. Uh,
Oh,
so it worked
is that
out.
who ended up to being your wife?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
it
so
worked out.
just for anyone who may not understand, so Michael and I were both Navy corpsmen, and what that means is essentially we go to Navy boot camp, then we go to hospital corps school, which is similar to like being a licensed LPN, like a licensed vocational nurse. But then from there, a lot of us split off, and we can do lab work. You can learn how to be a pharmacist, pharmacy tech. There's all kind of different things that corpsmen do for the Navy and Marine Corps. The route
Mhm.
that Michael and I took was to be trained with in Marine Corps medicine, which is combat medicine. So if you've ever seen a combat medic, that's exactly what we were being trained to do. And on the way to on the way there, what we have to do is stop. Were you at Pendleton?
I was.
Yeah. Okay. So we were both at Camp Pendleton. I was there June 19th of 2009. I remember because it's one of my best friend's birthdays. And waiting for that whole class to start. It's like you have to get a certain amount of people, and then a new class starts. We often have to do work at the place where we're waiting, so we're not going to just be idle. So there's a hospital there, and a lot of us work in the hospital. What I was doing was there weren't any more hospital jobs, so me and a couple guys, Wardak and Wilder. I don't know if you knew those guys, but we were assigned to facilities. So we were just moving carpet, well, removing carpet, moving file cabinets, peeling tile. But the cool thing was, as soon as lunch came, those guys said, "Oh yeah, you guys go to lunch, and we'll see you tomorrow." So we essentially did nothing but work out all afternoon and then go to the beach. So I
Nice.
enjoyed PSI probably as much as you did, but for different reasons.
Very nice. Very nice. Well,
So then
so
you classed up, and then how'd that go?
it was great. I really enjoyed field med. We had a good platoon. Actually, I think it was a pretty good class overall. It was a good time to be there. And you go through. Back then, we still had like the shooting portion and a lot of the training that since then I think has been taken out. I'm not sure. But it was
Really?
a good time. Yeah, I've heard different things, but I'll have to kind of reach back into my memory banks and kind of figure. It's been a
Yeah.
while, but
Yeah, and
kind of.
as you're talking it through, it reminds me of some of the stuff that I did. I remember shooting. I remember what do they call that? The kill house when everything was dark and people are yelling at you and there's gunshots going off and you have to trying to get people in the dark, stuff like that. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the book and some of the stuff and the conditioning that we'll come to later.
I know that we did that in field med, but I was thinking of CPM of
Oh,
the other course in division. But
gosh.
yeah, yeah, that it was that course, that part of the course at field med was much worse in combat trauma management in First Marine Division. But yeah,
So you
so
just mentioned First Marine Division, so I'm assuming that's where you went as soon as you finished with Field Med.
actually no, I went to third Medical Battalion, third MLG in Okinawa, Camp Hansen, um, right after field med. So I was there for 2 years, and it was a really solid group. Met some great people there. We ended up deploying to the Philippines for a humanitarian mission. Well, it became a humanitarian mission because of the typhoon that hit out there.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Our trip to Afghanistan was taken from us, which was one of the biggest morale killers, so to speak, because we had trained for it for months. We had prepared for it for months. I was supposed to be en route care, and the en route care course I went to in prep was actually really cool. Um,
Can you
and
explain what that is?
yeah, en route care is when you, as a corpsman, have to prepare to do your interventions in care while in transit in a helicopter. So
Oh,
you're preparing to receive patients on the helicopter and do your interventions to keep them alive and stabilized, or try to stabilize them when you get to the next echelon of care. And for MLG, this is huge, right? Level of care and kind of making that gray area is a big part of what MLG does in medicine, which is actually pretty cool. They have the mobile trauma bays to try to do more surgical techniques for resuscitated surgical suites, shock trauma platoons. What I actually didn't know very well back then, but I know now, they actually have like a psychological equivalent to shock trauma platoons, and that's why there was a psych tech there. And I
oh.
really didn't understand that back then. I'm just like, what is a psych tech doing here? But
Can you
so yeah,
explain a psych tech? Do you know anything about like how a person becomes a psych tech? I know that I've heard that term before, but I'm not really sure how somebody becomes a psych tech.
yeah, I got to know several great ones when I worked as a Navy contractor, as a civilian at one of the clinics while I was going to school. Um, there were some great psych techs that kind of identified the pipeline. They go to school now at Fort Sam Houston, I think. And you go through a pretty decent course that introduces you to the diagnoses, some assessment. They even give you some like interventions. I actually looked through the course requirements. Um, Thought it was pretty cool. I kind of had wanted to do it one time, but um, I don't know. I liked being in a before. Um, Even though I tried to do several other things, but I'll leave that aside. Um, so finished Third Med Battalion, went to San Diego, Balboa, um, but worked at the Coronado Clinic um, at North Island.
So sounds like you stole my orders.
It looked like I
Well,
did.
because when, and I'm still, you can probably hear I'm a little bitter. So um, after I finished field med, I went to 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. And from there, we deployed to Afghanistan twice. And then I got orders to San Diego. Well, technically, my orders. So first, I had orders to Sigonella, and I was so excited to be in Europe. And then they got canceled while I was on deployment, and I had to choose new orders. And Coronado was available, and I was like, fantastic! I'm going to go to Coronado. It's a beautiful place. It sounds cool because Navy SEALs are there and all that kind of stuff. But when I actually showed up and they started telling me specifically where to go, they said, "Oh, well, we just put Coronado on there. That doesn't really mean anything. You can go anywhere in San Diego where we want you to go." I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, okay." It's not like something you can argue. So I ended up at Miramar Air Base. And for people who don't know, Miramar is a Marine Corps air station. It
Yeah.
was the original Top Gun air station. When it used to be a Navy base, but now it's a Marine Corps base, and I worked at the clinic there. So you made it to Coronado specifically, and my order said Coronado, but I never ended up there.
Out.
But there's one specific thing you mentioned earlier that I think would be interesting to explore. When you said you guys got sent to the Philippines instead of Afghanistan, how much of a morale killer it is. And one thing I don't think people realize is that if you're not in the military and you don't have that mindset, if you're getting ready to go to Afghanistan and it gets canceled, I think civilians think that you're going to be like, oh, whew, thank God. But it's the exact opposite. And it's hard to explain. And I wanted to see why you think that happened to your group and maybe talk a little bit about why it seems like the exact opposite reaction was had.
It's definitely a tough question, and I don't want to appear like I'm going to assume that I know everybody's thoughts and feelings, right? Because that it's like, oh, we have the speaker for the whole unit right here, right? So I don't
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
be like that, but at the same time, um, I think, as you know, certain motivations become almost collective, right? Because either what drew you uh, to enlist during this time, right? This was, 2008, 9, 10, around this time. We knew what we, well, actually, that's actually another phrase that I don't particularly like when people say you knew what you were getting into, because we really didn't. Um, but we had
Right. In
we had
some
an
sense, I
idea.
mean, yeah, right. We at least knew that there is a possibility that you can actually go into combat because combat was happening.
Exactly. We knew that part. Um, but I think a lot of people don't have an emotional connection to the realities of it, because when you're young and all that comes with its own set of things. But anyway, to answer your question as best I can, um, many many members of the military, they they want to they want to experience what they've been trained to do, right?
Yeah.
And if they're the kind of individual that wants to experience that in a intense way, like I guess you could say action, combat, um, any of those types of things, it's kind of the thing that a lot of people want to experience. And this is the topic of On Killing as well, right? Because why would a sane person want to do that is what many people might ask. But um that's the topic itself. But in the military, a lot of individuals want to do that. Now, to be fair, there are some that don't, right? And it's interesting how, depending on how those individuals that don't want to go, how those make their motives clear is usually how they're treated, because a lot of times they're not treated so well.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly that when you were saying that, and trying to think of individuals where, and also like what you said with the collective motivation, and some of the topics in On Killing is the people who are excited and motivated and training and ready to go do this thing that we knew would come with those risks. Those were the people, and this is probably very not totally, but I think probably enhanced because we're Navy corpsmen serving with Marine Corps units, and especially Marine Corps infantry. So that whole ethos of going out, and just like in the book that we'll talk about, we used to answer questions in the affirmative by saying kill.
Mhm.
Hey, you gonna be at formation in 10 minutes? Kill. That meant yes. So
Yeah.
the whole ethos and that whole motivation, the whole spirit is moving in that direction, and you can get caught up and swept up in it, regardless if you know specifically what it is you're actually getting into until you experience it. So I saw that a lot, and there's a lot of people, not a lot, there were a few people who you knew were doing things to maybe avoid having to actually do that job. And especially because we're coming from the Navy into the Marine Corps, some of these guys joined thinking that they were going to be pushing papers and seeing patients at a little clinic in Miramar. But they end up doing things like this. And some of them, people may not know this, you can go to a clinic and you think you're just hanging out in San Diego or Hawaii or wherever you happen to be, and you're just seeing patients, in the United States or maybe in Europe, but then you get a note and it says, "Hey, you're going over here because we're short people, so now you're going to Afghanistan." So then that whole shock occurs too, and those guys coming to your units very often, no, not very often, I say, it's not rare that guys coming to your unit like that may be in shock for what's going on because they're getting acculturated to your family, your unit, a whole new culture, and then you're going off to war.
Yeah, and individuals who might not have those motivations, right? Since they don't serve the good of the group, and
Yeah.
especially if they end up being like a deployment dodger, right? Then they might have to force someone who's coming back from deployment to go again, right? And this happens. So
Yeah.
then they get kind of put in the out group a lot of time. So it's complicated, right? It's like, well, what were they doing there? What are other motivations for joining the military other than this? I think maybe it would be more common, the era after this, right? But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. Because we're going to get back to the point of this kind of topic, which is mindset, motivation for why would someone want to go to war, combat. experience killing. And then it goes into also the culture of the unit, right? Because after San Diego, which I met up with you a few times, I remember at some stand downs or briefs or something,
Right.
and we hadn't seen each other since Field Med. But after San Diego, I went to First Division, and then First Light Armor Reconnaissance Battalion, LAR. Um, I love those. I loved LAR. Went to Jordan with them for security operations, and then I ended up getting out of active, went into the reserves, and then did some time in 4th Tanks for 3 years, and then got out completely. Started going to school.
Where were you going to school when you got out?
Well, so when I got out of active duty and I got in the reserves, I got a full-time job working at the clinic on Camp Pendleton in 41 area where LAR's at. That clinic that I was at active duty, I ended up working as a contractor, as a medical support assistant, clerical duties, stuff like that.
Right.
And doing that, I was able to start going to school on base because they have Central Texas and Park University on base.
Oh, okay.
So I would go do the night classes right after work. And I did that for all of undergrad. Ended up getting my bachelor's in social psychology. And let's see. And then I got my master's at National in human behavioral psychology.
So so when you say National University, and the reason I asked is because I went to National. I was doing night school through National University when I was in San Diego at Miramar. How did you do National? Was it all online, or did you have any in person when you were at Pendleton?
So it was my understanding the program was supposed to be an in-person program, but it was in the midst of COVID and it was all online because of it. So
Gotcha.
that's my understanding, that it was supposed to be in person. It was convenient since it was online. And the kind of individual I am, I like to research things. Or maybe I should put that in past tense. I liked to research things. Now I'm not sure if I do. But yeah, so I did that, and I used that to kind of propel me to go to grad school at Alliant. So then I got into Alliant. I had to quit my job, my full-time job, which was a big change.
So you're at Alliant right now, and you're not working. You're just going to school, correct?
No, I work as well. Just I can't do a full-time job.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I
So
work as well.
yeah, and that reminds me. So I mentioned earlier, my wife went to Alliant, and in observing her um, taking licensure exams and just knowing her and talking about her experiences. One of the things I think people don't understand about being a psychologist is how much work it takes to not only get in and then finish schooling, but then the internships and the licensure and all the legal things that you need to know. So even going from different place to place, going from California, we live in Pennsylvania now, getting different licensure in different states because there's different legal things that you have to know for
Yeah.
each state. It was much more intense than I understood, and I have a much higher level of respect for just the amount of work it takes to get there. So how has your experience been with Alliant and going through the course and intensity and enjoyment, everything?
I mean, I have good things to say about my cohort, my experience, the training. It's been great. Just it's been intense. My I talked with one of the doctors that I worked with at 41 area, um, because as I was preparing, trying to understand how I was going to make it going through this, financially, things like that. But like, is there anything like a special program for someone that has a family to go through a grad school like this? And he was like, no, there isn't. And that is what makes it so intense. I mean, I can't afford to live down in San Diego, so I live way up here in Lake Elsinore. Uh, so I commute down to San Diego, and the commute's rough. Um,
How far of a commuter is it?
well, on I mean, it's regularly, I would say, 3 to 4 hours total a day. Because there's usually traffic, and
Yeah.
yeah, if I would just round it up like that, because it can vary. There's some good days where it's like, oh, I got there in only an hour and 15, 30 minutes. Uh, but it's definitely a toll. The harder thing though is that you have to work. Right? You have to work. You have to try to make the money. So, and you take up extra things like, hey, can I TA? Um, things like that. So working has been probably the biggest challenge while in this program, in addition to the practicum that you have to do, and
Hmm.
the workload of the classes. And I've had a couple of jobs since I've started. Um, so yeah, but it's good. I've had some great practicum sites. I've worked doing IOPs for active duty.
Can you
I've
explain
worked,
IOP?
yeah, intensive outpatient treatment program.
Hmm.
So an IOP is you're basically doing 3 hours or three different sessions of group therapy. Um, and it's usually around 3 times a week. So 3 hours, 3 times a week. And so this is still outpatient. It's not residential, but because you're getting so much of it, it's considered intensive outpatient. So, but
Oh,
it's
I got you. It's like
yeah,
it's an in between, and maybe some of those people might go in a patient for one reason or the other, or maybe scale back. But it sounds like a bridge in
yeah.
between one of the two
It's
things.
a, yeah. You're trying to prevent them from having to go to the next higher level of care, and you're hoping that with this they'll be able to come down a level of care and maybe just go into individual outpatient therapy or something like that.
Gotcha.
Um, so yeah,
So
so I did
it
that.
sounds like you're getting some work with specific communities, which in this case is the veteran community.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, as you go into the program in Alliance, are there pathways within just PsyD that you can focus on veterans, combat, PTSD, or is it generalized, or do you have different pathways that you can take that you've been able to apply some of your experiences here?
It's I would say it is somewhat generalized, but you can tailor your experiences in many ways. So for this program, there is a military emphasis. Um, so like I've taken an elective that's offered specifically for military. There are practicum sites that are military, like the one I did. And then you can tailor your internships for like VAs or military sites. You can do like continuous education credits for towards military affiliated things like Division 19. I did the Winter Institute with the Center for Deployment Psychology, which was a great opportunity and great training. And then also your dissertation, right? My dissertation is on this theme, though it is not so much on the topic of on combat or on killing, but it does segue into why I went here from where I was going to talk about First Marine Division.
Okay.
It's an interesting come back and go for. It shows the tangential nature of my brain. It is this confusing sometimes, but I think what I was going to say is, as I'm sure you can attest to even more than I can, the mindset of the infantry culture is different than if you were to go with one of the other Marine elements, right? Whether it's the logistics or the wing, right? And even within division, that subculture is a little bit different, right? Maybe between H&S and Alliant Company, right? So it gets a little bit. It's like a funnel almost, and
Yeah. Right.
the core of that subculture is very interesting. It's tribal in a sense. It's a little primitive, but I mean whenever I think about it, the mission of the infantry regiment just comes to mind, right? Because they drill into you, locate closer to the enemy by fire maneuver.
Yeah.
So this is one of the topics of my dissertation, right? Focusing on how the mindset and the subculture of infantry impact how we transition to the civilian world, right? For many reasons. But I know that's not the main topic, but I think it is somewhat related because it has to do with mindset and kind of it goes into desensitization, it goes into association, it goes into more of the collective mindset, right? And conformity, right? For good and for bad, conformity.
Yeah. It reminds me, I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's a movie about a combat medic who absolutely refused to shoot. And he was only, this is within the last maybe 3 to 4 years. And it was a really good movie, but I
Hacksaw Ridge.
found myself, I'm sorry?
Hacksaw Ridge.
It might have been.
Okay.
It probably is. But I kept finding myself angry with this guy because in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, I kind of understand the moral high ground of I'm out here just to save lives. But it's been drilled into my head that, yeah, you're going to save lives whether people are injured on their side or our side. But your first priority is to make sure your guys stay alive. And one of the best ways to make sure your guys stay alive is you put rounds down range to stop somebody from killing him. So, because every person that you don't stop from shooting is shooting at your buddies. And if he's shooting at him and he kills him because you didn't want to hurt somebody, then you're somewhat implicated in the fact that there was even somebody still alive to shoot your buddies. And so I'm kind of torn on that because I understand the idea that I'm going to go out here and do nothing but heal, but I would not want that guy on my team unless he was there in addition to whoever was there. If you're going to be there in addition, great. But if you're there, if you're the only corpsman there and you're deciding not to shoot, then that's one less gun that that group has.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like, I know what we're taught from a pretty early stage is attain battlefield superiority, right? Um, yeah, firing back is our part of scene safety, right?
Yeah, exactly. But
So
you know,
it's interesting. I had thought many of the same things that you had mentioned about that movie. I actually took a minute to watch that movie because of it, but I was assured by friends, family that it was a great movie, and actually I did love the movie.
yeah,
Um,
I did too.
but I did have that issue as well, because it's hard not to think about what's drilled into your head,
Right.
and how you can see the concept, right? The concept that, well, but am I allowing for my own buddies to go down because I'm not stopping some of them, right?
Right. Right. So I think
And
that I'm sorry, but I think that that really gets specifically into the book, particularly, and I want to make sure we do take some time to address some of the stuff in the book.
absolutely.
Um, so, in summary, my and give me whatever feedback, positive, negative, neutral. In my mind, the summary of this book is essentially this: human beings have an innate resistance to kill other human beings. And the way that the author shows this is in the incredibly low firing rates throughout World War One, World War Two, and previous battles. He does an incredible job of pulling a lot of this data and explaining why he believes it to be true. And that's one of my favorite things about how he did it. It's the process, not just his conclusions. And what we learned is that there's ways to help, I don't know, help people overcome that resistance to killing. And when we implemented, excuse me, when we implemented some of those tools, we saw firing rates go sky high. So we went from 15 to 20% firing rates in the Civil War, World War One, World War Two, to Korea. I think he has different quotes between 50 and 75%. And then in Vietnam, it's as high as 95%. Some of the ways that we condition our warriors to do that is instead of shooting at targets like bullseyes, we actually have silhouettes. We also have ways of training our soldiers and war fighters um, that's more realistic when you're actually going through and clearing buildings. People pop up instead of just targets. And there's a lot of tools that we utilize to increase the firing rates in Vietnam up to 95%. But unfortunately, we haven't planned for the consequences of doing that. Because if we increase the amount of firing, we increase the amount of killing, and we increase our ability to win those battles. But then we also have to take into account what trauma is being enacted on our um, war fighters when they do those things and how to properly deal with that when they come back. He goes into a lot of details about what happened during Vietnam and how we didn't have the social support systems. And it was actually the opposite, where we removed those social support systems. A lot of stories about getting spit on in airports. You can't even get a cab. And that's a big reason why we see a lot of this combat trauma from our veterans in Vietnam is because we increase the likelihood that they would experience trauma and then reduce um, the social structures that would help them accommodate to life when they left. So, how am I doing so far?
It's a great summary, and I think you have a great understanding of the message, and everything. So yeah, I totally. Um, the only thing is I get hung up on certain things, and it's just how my brain
Too.
works. So I do apologize for that.
Me too. Don't worry. Don't apologize.
So I think it would be accurate to say that most humans have an innate resistance to kill, but not all, right? And I think that's an important distinction. And I think part of some theories is exploring that why too. Why are some without that resistance, which is interesting of its own. And then if we were to, and obviously we can't really theorize too much because we don't have those statistics, but what if we went back 1,000 years? Then what will we get, right? And then why, right? So that's interesting too. But yeah, as far as what we have, right, when we incorporate desensitization, when we incorporate stress inoculation, when we incorporate dehumanization, and we start learning about all these things, and we use this to get our people to heal in whatever field they're in. We can't get around the fact that, okay, so what do we do after? All right, what do we do when they're done? When they come home, whatever. And this is the topic now, with the topic of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think it's worth saying that we can even just shorten it to post-traumatic stress, because there are some people that do have issue with the disorder piece. I don't, because I'm in this field. However, I also understand that this is a normal reaction in our brain to an abnormal situation. Well, we say abnormal because it's abnormal for us, but maybe in some areas it wasn't so abnormal,
Or
right?
timed.
Or time, exactly. So it is a normal reaction. So we can even remove the disorder piece for, or just acknowledge that we can, right? Within that realm of reactions, there's a lot of things that we know play roles. And this is not exclusive to killing. This is with anything that manifests post-traumatic symptoms, right? We know that the role of helplessness is a big piece of it. Even so much to say within the veteran population that sometimes it isn't even the killing that they took issue with. It was a moment of true helplessness, despite all of their training and all of their capabilities, all of their faith or whatever. It was that moment of helplessness. It is worldview, what we call disintegration, shattered worldview. This is a big piece of PTSD. Avoidance. Avoidance maintains PTSD. So there's a lot of things that we know are also present in general. But so I just want to kind of put those out there before inspecting specifically the killing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Especially, the one thing you said there that was really interesting to me was the disintegration of the worldview. Um, can you say more about that? And what, if any, role does naivete play in that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is kind of also known as the just world hypothesis, right? You grow up, you are taught things like the world is a just place, good triumphs over evil, uh, bad things don't happen to good people, type of things.
Mhm.
And then you go to war, you join the military, or you see something that completely changes your mind about what you believe about the world, yourself, other people. This shift can be difficult to put things back together. This shift can lead you to go all the way to another side of things, towards cynicism, pessimism, negativity, whatever it might be, to overcompensate. And then this has its own implications, right? So with post-traumatic stress specifically, from a shattered worldview, the implications of the world is dangerous is going to lead to anxiety, right? It has to. If you truly believe that it's that dangerous, then why wouldn't you be afraid? And if you believe that people were bad or you were bad, it's going to lead to depression. That's the implication of these beliefs. So beliefs about self, others, the world, all have um, a role in those implications.
Yeah, and that's, I think about very often, especially with naivete, I think about what it is I want my kids to know, understand, and see it with the world. And that's a big reason why I read specific stories and ancient stories to them, because I don't want them to think that the world is really just as you had described, um, because I don't want them to be naive. And I worry more about my kids being naive. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in Western nations, especially ours, who maybe don't even realize how easy it is to be naive. And I always think, because our lives historically are so simple and easy. And it's really hard for people to understand that until they're outside of that framework. Excuse me. And maybe, and another thing I thought of, and probably because one of my favorite all time movies is The Matrix, and I watched it last night. But I kept thinking about Neo when he's first introduced to the idea of the Matrix. They told him, we don't tell you this after a certain age because the mind has problems letting go. And as you were describing that, I was like, yeah, if you have that worldview and you see incontrafutable, I don't know if I said that word right or not, evidence otherwise, right? Um, then once that worldview is shattered, it doesn't just change the present, it changes the past, because everything you thought about today and yesterday and the future is now shattered. And that unknowing, that lack of knowing, that's what I think of when I think of anxiety, is the chaos. You don't know what's next, you don't know what's coming, and you don't have a framework to put things into. So I can imagine if that worldview is shattered, then that it's really easy and it would make sense to be anxious because you don't know what to expect anymore.
Yeah. I can't, I mean, I don't know all the answers when it comes to parenting and naivete and preventing that. But I do think that where you ended just now reminds me of a potential kind of answer, which is just learning how to be objective, right? I think that ability is its own. It has properties which kind of help us cope, right? If we could be objective, then we can cope with a lot of things. Whether
Can
you're
you give me an
looking,
example? I'm not really, I don't think I understand where you're going here.
my apologies for that.
Oh, it's not your fault. Me.
It's okay. Um, I guess I'm thinking from a cognitive behavioral lens, a stoic lens, a Buddhist lens, a mindful lens. Any of these, it is looking at the information that we're receiving from an event that happened, is happening, or happened, right? Um,
Oh, gotcha.
how we view it in terms of our worldview. Is this something that I'm going to say um, is just horrible, that I lost my job when I did everything right, instead of, well, I got on with this company that was up and coming, and I knew the risk that it might not take off, right? It might not take off. It's a tough economy right now, and I got laid off. Uh, that's uh, that's kind of what happened, right? Now, this isn't necessarily to avoid the emotion of feeling sad. You could do both. Both can coexist at the same time, right? I am sad that I lost my job. However, I understand that this is the situation, right? But trying to objectively view the situation itself, right? How it came into fruition, right? Because when we get emotionally attached to certain themes of events,
Right.
it can make things more biased, right? Like when someone does a criminal action against you, right? It's easy to get much more emotionally attached to this as opposed to kind of conceptualizing or understanding the why, right? Why did this happen? Um, Being able to at least objectively view it in addition to the emotional uh, aspect that you might be feeling.
Yeah, I can understand how tough that can be because you, I think that even ties into the whole worldview, where if you have that worldview and something objective is, and you're trying to be objective about what happens and it butts up against that worldview, it can be really tough for people to even be aware that they have a worldview through which they're viewing any action that they take that's taken about them that they see other people take. So maybe even like I'm not even sure where I'm going here, but like, how do we help people to understand that whatever they're viewing in the world is through a lens, and then and then identifying what lens that is, and helping them see how it tints their worldview, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of saying ultimately probably similar things here, right?
Right,
Uh,
right.
I think when we're looking at lens and worldview, I guess what I'm saying is if you can put a more objective lens, that will impact your
Mhm.
worldview, right? Because when I think of objective, I think of center, right? A more balanced, um, all encompassing method. That way, we're not just noticing all the negative or just positive. We're okay with all of it. We're kind of removing some of the biases associated with it, which can compromise the information that we're concluding. Um,
Right.
so it's kind of like that. It has to do with the mental filter, uh, cognitive distortion, the all or nothing thinking, stuff like that.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on a different theme, something you brought up earlier that we discussed a little bit when we were writing to each other. But and this is where this comes from for me is I had been doing a lot of reading on the origin of consciousness, and I don't know how many people out there have even heard of Julian Jaynes, much less read him and understand him. And I went down his rabbit hole, read his book a couple of times, found out there's a lot of authors in the Julian Jaynes Society who have done more work beyond that. But without getting into too many of the details, the idea is that human consciousness was learned, not simply innate. And then with every individual human being, like our children, through language and having the ability to abstract, they actually learn the type of consciousness that we today think of and consider consciousness, which is very different than what we had. He theorizes maybe 1,600 plus years ago. One of the ways they do that is by well, he does that, and the people in the Julian Jaynes Society researching it now is by looking at ancient writings from then and then some period afterwards. A good example is the difference between the Iliad and Odysseus. So the Iliad, there's almost no words or language that is introspective whatsoever. In the Odyssey, there's much more introspection by saying, this is how I feel, this is what they're thinking. There's almost nothing like that in the Iliad. Another example they use is biblical language. In the Old Testament, there's almost zero introspection, almost no language looking at the person and what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and coming up with reasons. In the New Testament, it's full of introspection. And they also go through that with some, I think it was Hindu writings as well. So that's what I see a lot of. And the reason I think this applies is because when I was reading through on killing, I kept thinking, in order for me to have an innate resistance to killing another human being, I have to be aware that that person is like me before I can empathize with them and not want to kill them. Before I realize that they are like me, I have to realize that I am. So that's one of the reasons that I was wondering your thoughts on something like that, and whether or not there's literature I'm not aware of where people discuss whether or not we had some of these same issues um, earlier on. Because I don't, when I read Iliad, I don't read anything about people coming back and having trouble. Not that they would write about that, um, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on those ideas.
Hmm. That's a lot. Whew, so many things come to mind. Um, very, very fascinating though, right? I mean, from the start of what you're talking about with language and introspection and finding empathy through that too, right? Having words to do that. So what comes to my mind, I guess, with that, I think it depends on a lot of things though. So if we're going to theorize what was different, right? I think there are a lot of confounding variables here, right? One of them is kind of immunities, right? What might make us more immune to certain things, um, depending on what we're being told, right? Which can kind of move into the dehumanization piece, right? Because as you said, you're like me, but if I determine that you're not like me, you're an other, you're subhuman, it might be easier to do certain things, right?
Right.
So if this dehumanization starts when you're a child, you're taught that these people, they're not good, right? That could
Right.
change things. So beliefs about others could have to do with it. Immunities such as emotional hate, right? Like these people killed your parents when you were young and you grew up becoming a warrior for the other side. You're going to go after them. You keep fighting. It's like maybe it's a family's at war for generations. Who
Right.
knows, right? Um, and then there's also exposure, right? You're exposed to seeing these things so much you don't know better. You don't know a better
Right.
world.
Right. That's normal.
Yeah. And then within what else did that just pull up to me? Exposure. Man, I had another one along the lines of being exposed to it, but I lost it.
Well, one of the
Um,
things you said that was interesting that was growing up and being around concepts of other people being dehumanized. And I thought, well, in order for us to think that dehumanization is bad, we have to start from the norm of being humanization, which I think ties into some of the ideas that we have to learn humanization And I guess at its core, what I was wondering with the book, and I don't have an answer. I don't expect that anybody specifically does. Was that he kept saying we have an innate nature. It's innate in our nature not to want to kill human beings, and I kept thinking, why? Is that the norm for all animals? And one other thing I looked up is, uh, especially when I started to think, well, if we have an innate nature not to kill other human beings because we see them as human like us, then that it took me into the space of committing suicide because no other creature in the animal world commits suicide. And the only way you can commit suicide is if you actually think of yourself in a way that you can destroy the self. And for some reason, I kept thinking that has to tie together in some way where if human beings are the only creatures that can commit suicide, we're also likely the opposite, the only creatures who can see ourselves in the other.
I mean,
I
yeah,
may have
I,
gone
I
too
I
far.
think so. I mean, but this ties to like, I mean, it's like if you experience shame, for example, right? You obviously difference between guilt and shame, feel bad versus am bad, right? So,
Well, can you
so-
say that? Can you say that again? I've heard people talk about the difference. I don't think I understand it.
okay, yeah. So the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is I feel bad. Shame is I am bad, right?
Is shame externally I don't know, I want to say verify, but I don't know if that's the right word. Is that part of the difference?
Shame could be explicitly or implicitly um, kind of received, right? You could be shamed from someone else, but it would still require somewhat of your permission, in a sense,
Right.
unconsciously or otherwise, to
Like a
be
psychopath wouldn't feel shame.
exactly. A psychopath wouldn't feel shame. So if you feel shame and you believe you are bad for a particular reason, then this um, might be a very difficult thing to overcome. If you experience this chronically and you're hopeless and you have the other things that contribute to suicidality, such as you have a problem that you want to end and your mind has formulated an option to end it, and that is suicide, right? So my point about bringing up shame, though, is the I am bad piece is similar to what you might need to say about someone that you killed, that they are bad.
Or just I am.
Well, I mean, is this absolutely necessary? I think I think from what you're saying is there has to be enough introspection in order to kind of start the process, right? But then
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I kind of wonder, you know, if you had no ability to introspect, you would still have certain primitive urges, right? And
Right.
killing might be part of that, right? But there would likely be no further introspection. But we don't know. We don't know what goes through a lion's
Right.
head on the day to day. But we know that there's probably not a deep, philosophical introspection because of what we understand about um, kind of the human brain, right? But I digress. I don't want to get into too much of what I can't really empirically validate.
Yeah. Well, that was really helpful the way you said it because I was thinking, um, for me to say I am bad, I first have to say I am, and I think that's part of what I was getting at. Where, I mean, chimps, lions, they kill each other, but they don't commit suicide. So that tells me that they have, like you said, there's going to be some natural drives and instincts that might lead them to kill other creatures, even creatures that are of the same species. But there's something different once you realize that I am and can see yourself, because then if you see yourself, that means you can also end yourself. And then you can, but that also means that you can then take the next step to see others in yourself, which would generate, hopefully, maybe, the concept of, I don't want to kill that because it is like me. So there's something about that feels wrong. So I'm wondering if there's steps in consciousness and ability that create what the author says is innate. Um, I guess that's it.
No, I mean it's a profound question. I just don't know if it's that simple or not. You know,
Right.
and because I just think that there's likely a lot of variables, right? I remember what the thing I was missing, the ecology, right? We see this today too in a military group, but the ecology of individuals help prevent post-traumatic stress from manifesting, because you went through it together or you're going through something together. You know that you understand, that everybody understands. So it's powerful. And this is what I think Sebastian Junger talks a little bit about in Israel's PTSD rate versus our own, right? Why is
Yeah.
there such a big difference,
Which
right?
which book of his is that in?
Tribe.
Okay, yeah, I have Tribe and I read it, but it's been a couple years. So
It's been a long
I
time,
really,
so I don't want to get too specific because
yeah.
I could be fairly wrong, but I know he does that comparison, and I know he uses the fact that they all go through similar things almost collectively, and he believes that this is one of the reasons for
Right.
fewer post-traumatic stress reports. And this is something that we talked about in one of my military classes, which is the ecology of the group itself that goes on deployment, that unit, right? And separating someone from their unit is actually a greater danger to be removed from that ecology, right?
That's, yeah. I remember in the book on killing, he talked about that, where one of the things that was happening in Vietnam is if somebody dies, they leave and then they get replaced by a new guy. Or if your time is up, you leave and you get replaced by a new guy. So these units were constantly shifting and they didn't have that cohesiveness that you're talking about, which to me, it makes obvious sense because you're doing a collective action and you're leaning on each other collectively as well for the spreading of guilt, or the spreading of accomplishment as well. Um, I'm we were fortunate in the sense that my experience was we all deployed as a unit and we came back as a unit. There was never any separation except for even a guy who got, there's one guy who got shot in the leg. It wasn't too serious and he actually came back to us later on. So he was able to join back in the group on the way back. And another thing is in Vietnam, they would be in the jungle fighting, and then maybe 3 days later, they're sitting on a couch at home. And that transition was so fast that it was hard to handle. We would go from Afghanistan, a tiny little base, to a larger base, and they had a cafeteria. And we're like, oh, wow. And then we go to a massive base with a gym, a cafeteria, and a store. And then we all fly back in a unit through Germany and Alaska. And then we're finally back home. For us, it was Hawaii. But that process probably took 7 to 10 days, maybe a little bit more than that. So we're
Yeah.
all relaxing. We're not under fire. We're working out. We're eating real food, and we're decompressing on the way back. So not only that unit cohesiveness, but the amount of time that we were allowed to accommodate to a new environment, I think was really helpful. And I even remember our. I can't remember if it was the chaplain who said this, but I know the chaplain gave us a lot of talks on the way back. And I think there's also a woman that they brought in to talk to us about our experiences coming back, and specifically talking about PTSD and saying, here, this is what it is. This is how it manifests. This is what you may experience. Often it gets better. If it doesn't get better, then you can, we have all these resources. And I always thought that was really helpful because I had some things happen to me when I was after my first deployment that I experienced where I was like, I'm not an angry person. Why am I angry right now? And I was like, oh, okay, I kind of see what's happening. And eventually it started going away and getting a lot better. So I think the environment that they've created for us now, um, it seems technically sound and incredibly helpful as compared to what I read in On Killing, which is almost embarrassing for what we did
Absolutely.
today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to try to also answer one of your previous questions that I think you were wanting to know that I think I missed. Um, one of the military classes that I took did say that there's some research looking at um, Greek mythology and kind of extracting certain things that kind of spell out ideas of experiencing post traumatic stress, and at least themes of post traumatic stress. Um, and their argument for it was fairly compelling. So we'll see if that comes out and what we kind of determine from that. And I want to say that the Odyssey was brought up, but I kind of forget. But I think
Right.
that one of the things that they were looking at and kind of extracting kind of messages within the stories and what these themes were and where they likely got them and what they were trying to say.
Yeah. And
However,
the class that you took, was it based on specific literature that like I could or anyone could look up, or where did that all come from?
a little bit of everything. It was based off of a lot of literature, is based off of experiences.
So it
A
wasn't like
lot.
one book where somebody said, here, let's look at PTSD in ancient Greece, and then a class taught around that.
No,
Was it
it was a
was
lot
the
more.
instructor led?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'll see if I can find anything more on it. Um,
yeah. I'd love to see that. I'm curious now.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
I'll see if I can find out more. But I
thank
think
you.
that another important piece, if we're going to talk about kind of violence, I like Rory Miller's kind of uh, he said something about violence that I always think is interesting, and I kind of resort back to every now and then. But he posed a question in his book. He wrote several books on the topic, but Meditations on Violence, Conflict Communication, both very good um, from a more anecdotal perspective. But he said, why do we use violence? Because it works, right? And when we think about aggression and violence, when we think about even emotional dysregulation, a lot of times we think about it in terms of coping skills to attain something, to communicate needs. So if we could attain the same thing or even better results by another means, we might use those means, right? If someone was so good at their job that made $1 million a year, would they go rob a cash register? Probably not, right? Unless they
Right.
literally just wanted the thrill of it, which is another topic of violence entirely. But um, you know, if someone is prone to angry outbursts, are they using that in the moment because they've exhausted all other ways of attaining what they need, and now it's like, this is what I know. This is what's worked for me in the
Right.
past. So,
And again,
uh,
I was thinking, I wonder if it's, especially like what you just said, if it's worked in the past. And I have particular people in mind that I've experienced this with, where it was almost as if that's what works for them, and that's what they're going to maintain doing. And sometimes it seems like that was their first go-to. It wasn't like even things were exhausted. It was like that's just how they are, and I kind of know that about them moving forward.
Yeah, and of course, this is there's a difference between what um, what he would call like uh, different kinds of violence, right?
Yeah.
Um, so then we get into intent, we get into motivations, different kinds of things like the type of violence to attain something versus the type of violence that is for you, right? And now we get into many other things psychologically, but I
Right.
think
Yeah, a little bit more practical versus I don't know what the other word would be for it, but it's almost like the dehumanization and the killing, where there's an emotional reason why they're attacking that person, and it doesn't necessarily gain them any profit.
hmm and there are oftentimes a few of those everywhere,
Right, right.
including the military. And one theory is that many years ago those were more prevalent, right? So like psychopaths, they were more prevalent in primitive days. That
I've never heard that. But how do we know that there were more psychopaths in primitive days?
I think looking at genotypes, and it's just I think a theory. Um,
Hmm.
I think the theory is that it was more adaptive evolutionarily. In primitive days, we needed more people to do certain things for the good of the group. It was for that at that time, it was adaptive, and it's less adaptive in a civilized society. It's more
Right. That
adaptive
makes
to
more
be,
sense.
empathetic and helpful, and part of the group than it is to be antisocial.
Right. Yeah. Because today, if you're antisocial or psychopathic, your reputation starts to get around faster than it would in a world where you can simply walk, run, whatever, 50, 100 miles one direction and nobody has any idea who you are. So I can imagine that strategy to gain power, influence, material goods would not work today nearly as well as it would then.
Yeah, except in selective positions, populations,
Right.
jobs, and ways to survive.
Right.
So yeah,
Right. So it's been an hour and 17. So I think I'm gonna wrap it up because I don't want it to be overly lengthy. But I absolutely loved this conversation. It's
absolutely.
not
Yeah,
often, yeah, it's not often that I get to talk to people who are interested in things that I'm interested in. Um, but I did want to. One thing we didn't go over earlier is I was curious where you are on your journey. And are you going for PhD or PsyD?
Saidi.
All right, so where you are on your PsyD journey, and how long it's going to take you to complete that whole process.
So I am in my second semester of my third year. So
Hmm.
after this, I will be in year four, and then in year five, I'll do internship. So yeah, it's uh,
A
it's coming.
long, arduous, tough process, but yeah, I'm
Yeah,
so happy for you.
thank you.
Happy, healthy family, and doing really well. And one of the things I thought about is I love talking to veterans who are doing things like this because very often I personally get annoyed at the idea that veterans are broken and we need to help them with this and that. And yes, if and when that's true, we need to make sure anybody, regardless of their status, we're assisting them and helping them, help pick them up and get them where they need to be. But there's also tons and tons of veterans out there who are using what they learned in their experiences to do things like you did. I mean, you're going to be a side D. One of my best friends is now a Do you remember? You may know Chris Menard. He's a
Oh yeah.
professor of neuroscience,
Yeah.
and I've got another buddy, Eric Dodson, who is in medical school now. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of guys out there taking advantage of the opportunities and their experiences, and really doing a lot of great things out there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. I mean, I've got a few friends who became PAs. One becoming an
Right.
NP. Um, some going back as officers. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
outstanding to see um, other
One of
veterans,
them's an
especially
F-18
corpsmen.
pilot now.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I love seeing corpsmen go back to be providers. Because I
Right.
think that we get a little taste of kind of being that sole health related
Yeah.
resource, and for me personally, as much as I was the medical asset, um, a lot of times if you're in a platoon of Marines, you're also the psychological asset. Right? You're there
Yeah.
for that kind of a support. And I realized that I think I almost preferred that. I saw how important that piece was in time of loss and grief, anxiety, hardship, etc. So we
Yeah.
won't get
That's
into
a
the
great point.
other stuff because that's a whole other topic. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're the only guy there that's trained to save their life. So they see you very specifically, and and vice versa. We see them very specifically. They take just as good care of us as we have them. So that's why we always
Absolutely.
have our.
Absolutely.
I so I want to do this again sometime. There's
Yeah,
a lot of topics I think that I'm really interested in. Like my wife is interested in, I mentioned she's a psychologist, and I always say you're interested in specific humans. I'm very interested in humanity. So that's how I come to understand the difference there. But I just want to thank you for doing this, and to our audience, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. I'm going to check back in with Michael sooner than later, see where he is on his journey, and maybe there's some other books that we're both interested in that we can discuss as
absolutely.
jumping off points.
Well,
All
thank you for
right,
having me.
I appreciate it.